L'honorable député de Beaches, East York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Very pleased to rise in the House today to have the opportunity to speak in support of this motion 533. As the Urban Affairs critic for the NDP caucus, Mr. Speaker, I take a special interest and especially applaud the member putting forward this motion for the inclusion of urban areas affected by the establishment of natural resource development. Too often, Mr. Speaker, we are presented with false dichotomies by this government and the false choices that flow from them. And that people see remote and rural life as distinct and separate and unconnected to urban life, I guess, has a partial explanation in the phenomenology of those lives. They're very different. They're very different experiences. People see very different things on a day-to-day basis. And so people say to me, well, Matt, you're talking about an urban agenda for Canada. What about rural and remote Canada? And this isn't to deny, Mr. Speaker, that there are issues distinct to rural Canada, distinct to remote Canada, and nor is it to deny that there are distinctly urban issues and considerations. In fact, our party has urged on this government consideration of the peculiarly urban issues in the cities of Canada. And as a critic for urban affairs, I've developed and released for all Canadians to read and consider an urban agenda for Canada. But the urban agenda, Mr. Speaker, and our views on cities and urban life in this country is very much mindful of and informed by the fact that urban Canada, our cities, sit in a broader context. They are part of a broader ecosystem. Our water comes from somewhere, usually other than our cities. Our food, usually, or the preponderance of it, comes from somewhere other than our cities. It's kind of captured, Mr. Speaker, in that common phrase that we see on the bumpers of cars and so forth, that farmers feed cities. And so cities are shaped, Mr. Speaker, by the broader landscape in which they are embedded, and of course the converse is true as well. Cities shape the broader landscape in which they are situated. And this is true of all cities. It was true in a city in Saskatchewan that I visited, and it was in the context of a booming extractive economy out there that the Chamber of Commerce said to me, it's not just about environmental assessments. We also need to have community impact assessments on the resource development that's happening outside the boundaries of our city. And the suggestion was that before the next big project goes in, there needs to be an assessment of whether that city can in fact handle the traffic that flows from that project, handle the housing required by the influx of workers for that project, and so on and so forth. And in another city in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, a large community service agency told me that it was only when the rural and remote extractive economy really started to boom that the extent of the true challenges of homelessness in that city actually emerged. And as with any ecosystem, the system flows one way or another, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to tell you a bit of a story about a natural resource development project close to Toronto. It was the Melanchthon Township mega quarry, Mr. Speaker. Melanchthon Township sits about 80 kilometers north of Toronto. It's Class 1 farmland up there. It provides about half the potatoes eaten by the citizens of Toronto annually. And the land is called the Headwaters because it sits atop a number of watersheds that provide fresh water to about 1 million people in cities in Ontario. Thousands of acres of the Headwaters and of Class 1 farmland, Mr. Speaker, were purchased a few years back by what was then considered to be the 10th largest financial fund, hedge fund, I think is the appropriate name in the world. And the plan was, Mr. Speaker, to build a mega quarry where that farmland existed, to take 2,300 acres and go down 200 feet, Mr. Speaker, for the purpose of getting aggregate rock, Mr. Speaker, to ship into our cities to continue to build out the sprawl of Toronto and the surrounding municipalities. Now, 2,300 acres, Mr. Speaker, actually is about half the size of my riding of Beaches, East York. And so it was very obvious to share with people a kind of vision of what this thing would look like. So half my riding going down about 20 stories. And one of the interesting things is, Mr. Speaker, being the headwaters, the water table sat just below the surface, about 20 feet, requiring for the mining of this aggregate the pumping of water in perpetuity. Efforts were made repeatedly, Mr. Speaker, to engage the environmental assessment process on this, but that process has been so ravaged and degraded that there were really no hooks. But what was understood by thousands upon thousands, Mr. Speaker, of residents in Toronto was that this issue was their issue, that the building of a mega quarry on Class 1 farmland 80 kilometers outside of Toronto was in fact an urban issue. And at one point, Mr. Speaker, thousands of Torontonians went north one weekend and clambered across fields and through the woods for a local food cook-off put on by professional chefs. On another occasion, Mr. Speaker, I organized a bus tour of constituents of mine and other NDP MPs in Toronto to go north to meet the farmers who were holding out from the hedge fund, hanging on to their farmland. And finally, Mr. Speaker, there was a soup day held to support the fight against the mega quarry. It was held in my riding in a park, and 40,000 Torontonians, Mr. Speaker, came out to my park to buy soup, but most importantly, Mr. Speaker, to support the concerns of those farmers and other residents living in and around Melanchthon Township about the development of this mega quarry. Similar activities, Mr. Speaker, have taken place outside of Toronto and have engaged the citizens of Toronto. Not all of these, Mr. Speaker, have been natural resource development, some quite the opposite. In fact, on the federal lands in Durham region, this government has, and previous governments going back to the 1970s, have proposed to take Class 1 farmland and build an airport just to pave it over, Mr. Speaker, for the continuing development of the city. But like the mega quarry, Mr. Speaker, the citizens of Toronto understand that issue and that project as well to be an urban issue, that those farmlands outside the city are important, Mr. Speaker, for local food security, for our city, so that we have close to our urban life easy access to fresh food. And as with the mega quarry, Mr. Speaker, it was easy to fill a bus of constituents and head out and tour those lands in support of farmers who are living by lease on those lands, and so on. And this, Mr. Speaker, is clear that where there is an ecosystem where our cities are embedded in a broader landscape, so is there also a social ecosystem, and we are connected, the First Nations, both within our city and outside our city, whose lands these are, Mr. Speaker, the farmers whose lands these are, and urban residents as well understand that we are connected this way. And this, Mr. Speaker, was and remains my attraction to the opportunity that Bill C-40 presented to us. Unfortunately, it was an opportunity spoiled, but the opportunity for Canada's first national urban park, so that we begin to at least to aspire to the notion that urban Canada and the concept of ecological integrity in our cities, so that we can be more energy sufficient, more food sufficient and secure in our own cities, is possible, that we can begin to build and shape our cities so that urban life can exist more lightly on this landscape. So let me conclude, Mr. Speaker, by applauding the motion in its entirety, and most specifically let me applaud the inclusion of the urban and urban communities in the motion, and by extension the kind of collaborative and inclusive decision-making process that will rise up from the passage of this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate. Are you pleased to débat?